Okay, welcome everyone to the CrySP Speaker Series on privacy. It's our great pleasure to have Nate Cardozo with us. Nate Cardozo is from the Electronic Frontier Foundation. He is currently senior staff attorney on the Civil Liberties team, but come Tuesday, don't tell anyone yet, it's a surprise, he will become Senior Information Security Counsel at EFF, where he will be in charge of all the information security file. So that's great and exciting for Nate. So we won't put this video online until Tuesday. Okay, Nate has been working on the front lines of the crypto wars for a long time as a litigator and helping people win their cases against the government.
And helping people not have cases against the government. That is my win condition.
Yeah, it's even better. So
cool.
Let's welcome him.
Thanks. Thanks, Ian, and thanks to the rest of you for having me here. It's my honor and privilege to be talking to this group. I will give the standard disclaimer that I give at the start of every talk. I am a lawyer, and I'm not your lawyer. And I'm not going to give you legal advice in this talk, even if you beg. Number one, because I'm not licensed in Canada. And number two, because this is not a privileged conversation. If you want legal advice about US legal issues, my email address will be at the end, as will my cell phone number, and I would be happy to give it to you in a one-on-one context that is not being live streamed. So as Ian noted, I've been working on crypto policy for a while, for the last maybe 6 years. Not as long as some of the folks in this room, but to me it feels like an eternity. And it's been a busy time. And in this talk, I'm going to talk a little bit about the past. Probably the pretty picture slides are all going to be about the past. I'm going to talk about the fact that what is old is new again. Everything that has happened before is happening again right now. And I'm going to talk about the future. What are the likely challenges that people who design, implement, and use cryptography around the world will be facing in 2019? I'm even going to make a couple of predictions, which, if you know my type, the lawyer type, we are not generally inclined to do, but I'm going to break out a little and give you some predictions in the future. This talk is mainly US, Australia, and UK law. I actually don't know very much about Canadian law. For instance, my first slide, end-to-end encryption is legal, period, said Jennifer Granick, the former Civil Liberties Director of EFF, now Cybersecurity Counsel at the ACLU. I believe this is true about Canada, and it's certainly true in the United States. In 2016, end-to-end encryption was legal. In 2018, end-to-end encryption is legal, period, sort of without restriction in the United States. How did we get there? From approximately 1784, when Joseph Bramah invented a particularly good lever lock, until the second half of the 19th century, there was such a thing as perfect security. That statement is a complete lie that I just uttered, but conceptually it's true. It was possible to build a safe that was actually secure. The lock couldn't be defeated, and with the advent of overlapping cast plates, you could hide the rivets, so you couldn't knock off the rivets. All you had to do was build the safe heavy enough that it couldn't be dropped, because if you lift up and drop the safe, it'll crack open. And so that's what folks did. But of course, lock pickers have been around as long as locks, and in 1851, a locksmith named Hobbs picked Bramah's unpickable lock. It took him 51 hours, but he did it. He was actually competing in what was one of the first attested bug bounties. A locksmith in London had one of these locks, and he offered a reward if you could pick it. And Hobbs took 51 hours to complete it. Around the same time, our friend Nobel invented TNT. And now anyone can blast their way into something like this. But as I noted, everything I just said was entirely false. People broke into safes all the time in that intervening 67 years between Bremer and Hobbes, but not by picking the locks. You overlapped your cast steel plates to hide the rivets, but you left the hinges exposed, you idiot, and someone just knocked the hinges off of the thing, and the door fell right off. This is a good example of how implementation is often where your weaknesses are, even if the spec is perfect. John Gilmore, one of the co-founders of the Electronic Frontier Foundation, in something like 1993, gave his famous pronouncement, "The internet interprets censorship as damage and routes around it." That wasn't particularly true then, when he said it, but it's a lot more true now. In 93, we didn't have Tor, we didn't have VPNs, we didn't have domains by proxy, and we only had the very first inklings of what were to become anonymizing proxies. And for more than 2 decades, the internet has provided us with a truly global platform for expression. We can write art, we can write music, we can write about politics, we can post cat pictures, we can do 419 Nigerian print scams, and we can contribute to open source crypto projects on the internet. And anyone can do so, anywhere around the world, with obvious limitations. Okay, so this is a little bit of an anachronism. Perl wasn't, all that in the time frame that we're talking about, but this is an implementation of the RSA algorithm. In the early 1990s, it would have been illegal for me to bring this computer across the United States border into Canada and show you this slide. It would have been just as illegal for me to do this as it would have been to sell a tank to the Soviet Union. Because crypto, encryption technology, was regulated as part of the United States munitions list. Actually, Canada was sort of included in that, and I probably could have brought this into Canada, but I certainly couldn't have brought it into Mexico. The US government decided that this was a weapon and had to be regulated. And in order to post this script on the internet, you had to get a license, the same type of license that you'd have to get if you wanted to sell hand grenades on eBay. The fear was that this would become this. What's that? Someone raise their hand. That's Enigma. This isn't the Enigma machine, it's actually just the set of its code wheels. The Enigma cipher is most commonly known today as the cipher that the Nazi Navy used to protect its communications. But that's not its origin. The Enigma cipher was developed to protect the European banking system pre-World War II. It became famous when, after modification by the Nazis, it was put into use as what was, for a while, an unbreakable cipher that gave the Kriegsmarine perfect security as against the Allies. And it took a set of stolen code wheels, like these, the invention of the computer, and the application of the greatest cryptographic minds of their generation in both Poland and the UK in order to break that security. Note, it also took an implementation flaw. One of the only reasons why they were is because they messed up and reused codebooks when the spec said they were not to reuse codebooks. So the fear was that this, something invented to protect the US banking industry, would turn into this, something invented to protect the European banking industry, and give the Soviets the ability to affect their nefarious plans to take over the world, because that's what the Soviets planned to do, obviously. And it gave us this. So there are some people who are obviously old enough to know what this is, and there are some people who perhaps are not.
It was in my class yesterday.
So back in the day, you had to choose which version of Netscape Navigator you wanted. The one that Ian could break very easily, or the one that Ian actually had to work a little harder to break. But we didn't have geo-IP locators. We didn't have any real way of preventing the spread of this sort of encryption. And it led to things like this. It might have been illegal to put this on the internet, but it wasn't illegal to wear this through an airport and fly to Europe. That's crazy. it led to this, right? Theo DeRat doesn't live in the United States. He lives here. And he was not subject to the export regulations that developers living in the United States were subject to. It led to this. If you don't know what that is, I'll ask Ian later after class. I have someone a somewhat friend of mine we were talking about last night, a guy named Ryan Lackey, lived out on this thing for 6 or 8 months at one point. This is, okay, I'll say. This is the Principality of Sealand. It is a World War II era anti-aircraft platform in the North Sea that some wacky Brit decided was his own country. And they founded a data center out on this thing in the late 90s in order to be a crypto-anarchist state. Havenco is what it was called. Sealand is still there. I think it's unpopulated at this point. The prince lives in like Manchester or something. It led to this. I'm not going to talk about this quite yet. And all of this upset a lot of crypto-anarchists and libertarians and computer scientists and security professionals and, yes, lawyers in the US, in Canada, and around the world. And you know, if all you have is a hammer, then everything looks like a nail. I'm not a computer scientist. The last computer system I administrated for pay was a Microsoft front page installation in 1999. And that, like, you know, that was a long-ass time ago. But what I do have is a JD. And if you have a JD, everything looks like a lawsuit to you. So this is the title page of what is now probably the most famous court case in the United States about encryption. A grad student at the University of California, Berkeley, walked into the EFF offices in the mid-90s. His name is Dan Bernstein, and he wanted to publish a paper about an encryption algorithm he had designed called Snuffle. And he was he did this essentially to poke the State Department, to make them get mad at him. And so he wrote the paper. He wrote several versions of the paper, one of which didn't even include the algorithm itself. It only included a discussion of the algorithm. And told the State Department, I am going to publish these on the internet. And the State Department said, oh, no, you're not. See the United States munitions list and ITAR, the export regulation that prohibits this. And he said, what about, you know, even the version that doesn't actually include the algorithm? And they said, yeah, even the version that doesn't actually include the algorithm. And so my now boss, who at the time was actually a private practice attorney in Silicon Valley, was hired by the Electronic Frontier Foundation to bring a challenge against the United States munitions list. It went all the way to the Ninth Circuit, a couple of different times for weird procedural reasons that make no difference to this class. And we won. And the Ninth Circuit held that code is speech. Quoting from the opinion, the availability and use of secure encryption may reclaim some portion of the privacy we have lost. Government efforts to control encryption thus may well not only implicate the First Amendment, which is the US protection of free expression, but also the constitutional rights of each and every one of us as potential recipients of encryption's bounty. The United Nations Special Rapporteur for Freedom of Expression, and I'm trying to find my cursor and failing. Okay, there it is. The UN Special Rapporteur for Freedom of Expression elaborated that encryption protects not only security and privacy, not only free speech, but the right to hold opinions without interference. Speech, privacy, and security, none of these are absolute rights. Each may be restricted under certain circumstances. But the right to hold opinions under both US and international law is absolute. Encryption allows us to flesh out, memorialize, and store our opinions free from interference in a way that almost no other technology does. And that was the state of the law from 1997, essentially until today. And of course, there were attempts to change that along the way. I wish I owned this button. I don't. This is in the EFF library. But back in the day, do you remember the chip that I showed you, this guy? This is the Clipper chip. This was an attempt by the National Security Agency, the NSA in the United States, to give Americans secure telephone communications, not cell phones. Cell phones kind of didn't exist at the time. Talking about actual landline phones. This was a way, supposedly, of encrypting our landline conversations in a way that was completely unbreakable to anyone except the NSA. The Clipper chip used the skipjack encryption algorithm, which included a law enforcement backdoor with something called the law enforcement access field, the LEAF, which was a form of key escrow. So session keys were encrypted twice, once to the recipient and once to the government. And thanks to folks like Matt Blaze at the University of Pennsylvania, implementation flaws were very quickly discovered in skipjack, and this went nowhere. And the internet was a safer place for it. This was what we at the time called, and this wording has come back to bite us perhaps, this was our golden key campaign in 1996 that EFF launched. My first homepage back in the day, back when we called them homepages, had this on it because I was a supporter of strong encryption and EFF all the way back in 96 when I was in high school. The Clipper chip failed, thank goodness, and we thought we had won. We thought we'd solved the field. Encryption is legal and exportable. Our friends in Mountain View and Cupertino are free to ship products such as this that protect their users' security to the best of their ability. And folks like Moxie and Adam Langley and the people in this room, some of who you know, are free to publish free and open source encryption on the internet in the United States and in Canada to their heart's content. But thanks to the Five Eyes, and especially our good friend, the former director of the FBI, Jim Comey, more work remains. And we're back to where we started. In 1997, the then director of the FBI said, "We're in favor of strong encryption, robust encryption. The country needs it, the industry needs it. We just want to make sure we have a trapdoor and a key under some judge's authority where we can get there if someone is planning on a crime." That sounds almost verbatim like what the current FBI director, Christopher Wray, said in front of Congress a month and a half ago. And that was 21 years ago at this point. The new crypto wars 2.0 or the second or whatever we want to call them, began essentially in 2015. iOS 8 came out, which included full disk encryption on these for the first time. Android M came out the same year. WhatsApp in 2015 joined iMessage in implementing end-to-end encryption across their entire product line. And that's to say nothing of things like Signal and Tor. But real encryption became common in 2015 for the first time. And that's led us to this. It's led us to things like the FBI director saying encryption is merely a business model. It is not a technology. There are plenty of companies, said Jim Comey, who can read their users' data and unlock encrypted phones. It's just a marketing pitch that Apple is pushing. And combined with backroom pressure, it looked for a moment in 2015 like we were about to lose everything. That didn't happen, and I'm kind of happy that it didn't happen. Anyone know what these are? TSA keys. These keys will open any locked baggage in any airplane hold in the world. One of these four, there's only four. And you can buy them on eBay for $1.99. So this is what happens when we do key escrow. Or you could just take a picture of this and print your own right now. I'm sure there's a 3D printer or a CNC machine on campus that can print something like this. This is what we're worried about, right? This is not security at all. This is security theater, as with so much else with the TSA. This is just for show. And that's not what we want. I don't have a slide for this, but IDG and Lookout, which is a survey company and a mobile security company, did a survey in 2013, 2014, before the advent of full disk encryption on mobile, that showed that out of the 3 million lost and stolen phones in the United States in those 2 years, fully a quarter of them resulted in identity theft. And that's just that's just the measurable ones. Now that number is close to 0. I had my phone stolen at knife point a couple of years ago, and I kind of wasn't worried. It had everything on it, but I felt, and I think I was correct, in feeling that it was secure because we don't have this, because the folks who stole the phone can't go on eBay and spend $1.99 for a key to get into it, unlike my suitcase. And so we're back. And we have to defend the position that we thought we had won in 1997. Ian, do you remember when this paper came out? 2016? 2015 or 2016. But this was our first real salvo in the fight against Jim Comey's push to end end-to-end encryption. I actually think that the keys under doormats analogy is slightly flawed. It's not that, well, I can talk about why that is later, maybe in Q&A. But this is an incredibly important tool for lawyers like me, because even lawyers can understand at least the executive summary of this paper, if not the whole thing. And if lawyers like me can understand the executive summary, that means I can drop it on the desk of a staffer on Capitol Hill, and they will as well. All too often, security papers are written in a way that only security engineers can decipher, and this is one of the pleasant changes to that. Quoting from it, we would find that backdoors would pose far more grave security risks, imperil innovation, and raise thorny issues for human rights and international relations, for 3 reasons. Oh, July 2015, I have it in my notes. That's when the paper came out. First, lawful access would necessarily abandon advances in encryption like forward secrecy and authenticated encryption. Second, it would necessarily increase system complexity. Keys under doormats. This is where the metaphor breaks down. It's not that the bad guy is going to lift up your doormat and find the key. It's that the bad guy will look at the entire system and find a window that you didn't even know was there. And finally, it would concentrate the attacker's focus onto a very limited set of failure points. Need I remind you? By definition, this material will have to be kept online because of the access requirements that the FBI and others are demanding. So in typical Washington fashion, Jim Comey says, okay, well, you guys don't want backdoors, and this is a direct quote, we're not seeking a backdoor approach. We want to use the front door. A Washington Post editorial said, quote, a backdoor can and will be exploited by bad guys too. However, with all of their wizardry, perhaps Apple and Google could invent a kind of secure golden key. And that's where the golden key came back to bite us. There's an old saying that sufficiently advanced technology is indistinguishable from magic, right? This is magic to the policymakers on Capitol Hill. They don't know how it works, and they really have no interest in figuring out how it works. They know that it's impossible, though. They know that this thing couldn't possibly do all the things that it does. And only the wizards at Apple and Google bless it with their magic fingers and make it work. So just nerd harder and give us what we want. Math be damned. And the math be damned part is actually probably more important than people in this room think it is. In my world, there's a common saying is, you know, I didn't go to law school to do math. I get other people to do it for me. This is true in my household. My wife has an MBA, and she's the one who does all the numbers because I don't understand this stuff. And that's actually very pernicious, right? The then Prime Minister of Australia last year said, when asked by a reporter whether the laws of mathematics prohibited the sort of secure backdoor that he was advocating, said, "This is Australia. The laws of Australia apply in Australia, not the laws of mathematics." He has an engineering degree, I will note. So, the title of this talk was Fantastically Bad Laws and Where to Find Them. And there's a lot of them. We can look in a lot of different places to find fantastically bad laws. But the first place we'll look is across the pond at the Investigatory Powers Act of 2016. The Investigatory Powers Act purports to regulate telecommunications operators all around the world, so long as they do business in the United Kingdom. It applies to manufacturers of hardware, it applies to developers of software, and it applies to vendors of services. And it says in section 189(4)(c) that operators may be obliged to remove electronic protection if they are served with a technical capability notice. It goes a little bit further than that, but not much. Essentially, at the Home Secretary's discretion, if she determines that it is practicable for a company to comply with a technical capability notice, then they must, at penalty of no longer being permitted to provide their hardware, software, or service in the United Kingdom. That's kind of terrifying. We don't really know how this is going to work. The Investigatory Powers Commission was only impaneled in, I think, March of this year. And to our knowledge, this was definitely true in July. It may not still be true. But to our knowledge, none of these orders have issued yet. Of course, once the first one does issue, we still won't know because it will be gagged under UK law. Second, it would also grant, it does also grant the Home Secretary, which here you can read as subtext for GCHQ, to issue a national security notice, another secret instrument, even more vaguely drawn, that would require operators to carry out any conduct, including the provision of services or facilities, which the British government considers necessary for the interests of national security. That's it. They can be forced to do pretty much anything. Australia has some crazy stuff going on too. Australia passed the Defense and Strategic Goods List. This is their implementation of the Wassenaar arrangement. If you want to know more about Wassenaar, come to me after class, and I will tell you. In the United States, we have this. We haven't actually implemented it yet. Ditto Canada, you guys haven't actually implemented it yet, but Australia has. And Australia's goes far beyond what Wassenaar actually requires and prohibits the intangible supply of information, of encryption technologies. What does that mean? At first, it meant that you couldn't actually talk about encryption in Australia unless you knew that everyone in the room was an Australian citizen, not just a permanent resident, but a citizen. That's nuts. And that included specifically encryption with anything more than a 512-bit key length. That is considered dual use. Everybody freaked out and sent letters to the Department of Defense. That's not how I spell defense, but that is how they spell defense. That is how you spell defense? I don't spell it that way. Everybody freaked out, and everybody and their mother sent letters to the Department of Defense. And we got a couple of exemptions written into the implementation, one of which is basic research. So it actually is legal to teach encryption without verifying the citizenship of every Australian in your class. However, only basic research is exempt. Research surrounding hardware implementations, for instance, is not. You cannot teach a class in Australia about TPMs or the Secure Enclave or HSMs to people who are not Australians. Can't talk about it on television, can't write about it on the internet. That's not actually being enforced right now, but it is technically a violation of Australian law to do any of these sorts of things. There's a push right now to get fundamental and applied research added to the exemption, but the political climate in Australia is maybe even more freaked out about national security than the political climates here or down in the States. Why that is a little bit beyond me. They view China as a menace, which fair, maybe it is, maybe it's not. But China's not invading Australia anytime soon. Like, that's just crazy to me, but neither here nor there. Australia is also considering, they haven't actually passed this one yet, which is why we don't have a number on the bill. There's a really great internet video, which I did not include, which labeled it the ass bill, which I thought was kind of funny. But it's the Assistance and Access Bill. It cribs from the United Kingdom's Investigatory Powers Act of 2016, but it actually goes significantly further. The bill would require operators of technology, so more than just the hardware, services, or software that, that the UK goes after, but any sort of technology, to comply with even broader and even more gagged government orders, free from liability and hidden from independent oversight. In the UK, there's at least the Investigatory Powers Commission, which is supposed to rule on each of these things before they become law. Australia has no such safeguard. It also goes beyond the menu of available options is available to more agencies in Australia if this thing passes than in the UK. In the UK, it's available to law enforcement and national security. Australia gives it to border and intelligence services, customs services, as well as their version of DHS. And it permits this non-court unaccountable commission to order the maintainers and creators of technology to do, quote, acts and things to protect the interests of Australia's national security, the interests of Australia's foreign relations, or the interests of Australia's national economic well-being. Acts and things, of course, is largely unspecified. But in the committee notes, they note that it is to enable surveillance, enable hacking into computers, enable remote data exfiltration from private companies, public networks, and individuals. Further, because providers of technology is so broad, it could apply to individuals, including individuals working within a company. That individual would be gagged on his or her own person, which means hypothetically, we could see an order issued to a systems administrator in an Australian company gagging that administrator from telling their boss that they were gagged. That doesn't exist in Canada, it doesn't exist in the US, and it doesn't exist in the UK, and it scares the crap out of me. China has done some pretty encryption hostile things as well. Their statutory scheme is rather less complicated than the UK or Australia's. The 2015 anti-terror law says that providers, largely undefined, shall provide technical interfaces, decryption, and other technical support, period. So we don't really know what that means, but it does mean, for instance, that Apple can be forced to host Chinese users' iCloud data within China. We know that Apple can be forced to include the Chinese version of WEP on their on iPhones that are sold in China rather than WPA. And we know that things like Google and Facebook, because they're so unfriendly to the Chinese government, can be straight up banned there. Turning to the US for a little bit, we thought that we had thanks for Obama to give. In 2015, he said, we will not, for now, call for legislation requiring companies to decode messages for law enforcement. How long do you think that lasted? A month. In November, a leaked National Security Council memo, first reported by Reuters, said that they wanted to identify laws that needed to be changed to deal with going dark. Going dark is the law enforcement and intelligence community's word for encryption. This memo didn't actually become public until early 2016. The important thing to note about this memo is that it said, just flat out said, that they were going to wait until something big happened that involved encryption to turn the national dialogue towards their side. Do you guys remember what happened the next month? And by March of 2016, this was an interview that Obama gave at South by Southwest, and he thought that this was a very clever way of turning the audience at South by. It went over like a lead brick, thankfully, but they thought that this might fly. And of course, as I noted, this happened in November. The National Security Council said they were looking for an opportunity to identify laws that should be changed. And in December, the next month, there was a shooting in San Bernardino. And we ended up with the Apple versus FBI case that I bet you're all familiar with. I'm going to not talk about the case itself right now, and if anyone wants to hear me talk about it, just say so afterwards. There was also a case in Brooklyn happening at the same time, which got a little bit less press, but was pretty much just as important. Both of these litigations fizzled. The FBI gambled. They thought they were in a win-win situation. Either they could win in court and get court precedent that says they were permitted to order a backdoor, or they would lose in court, and they'd be able to take that loss to Congress and use that court loss as ammunition to get the laws changed. Saying, look, the court said we didn't have the power, you have to give us the power. The first thing that happened, actually, was in my home state of California. Right at the start, in January 2016, a California State Assembly member introduced a bill, an almost identically worded bill was introduced in New York, that would require any smartphone sold in the state to be, quote, capable of being decrypted and unlocked by the manufacturer or its operating system provider. This is the attempt to cover both iOS and Android. Okay, so when this thing is sold, let's say for the sake of argument that full disk encryption is turned off and there's just a little switch to turn it on. That would have passed muster under this law. So luckily, these things went nowhere. We went to, my colleague of mine went to Sacramento to testify against this bill. This bill was actually introduced by a Democrat, by the way, not a Republican. And thankfully, it was defeated. I'm not going to talk about, well, okay, so there's other cases that we've sort of heard rumors about. There was a New York Times article talking about a wiretap order against WhatsApp. There was a Reuters report talking about a wiretap order against Facebook Messenger. We really don't know what happened. We think that both of those cases fizzled out, but they never became public. There may be FISA court orders that we don't know about. The FISA court is the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court, which meets in a literal Faraday cage in Washington, D.C., in the basement of the D.C. District Court. And we're in the middle of a FOIA case, a Freedom of Information Act case at EFF, to get access to any opinions that the FISA court may have issued regarding decryption. Congress luckily passed a law in June 2016 that says any new interpretations of the law that the FISA court gives have to be made public, at least in redacted form. So the law is, we think, on our side here. The government obviously disagrees. The biggest thing that happened in 2016 as a result of San Bernardino was a bill introduced by Senators Richard Burr of North Carolina and Dianne Feinstein of California. It never got a bill number because it was never formally introduced, but it was floated. And the Burr-Feinstein bill would provide for both criminal and civil penalties against the vendor of a device or service or piece of software that did not provide decryption capability on demand to the United States government. Applied to communications, storage, and even licensing, which means that app stores would have had to review every single one of their apps to see if any of them included encryption. And it wasn't just communications encryption or full disk encryption. It actually would have outlawed general purpose computing, because a general purpose computer can be modified to do anything, right? I was on Capitol Hill earlier this year in May, and Dianne Feinstein's Judiciary Committee staffer told me that the senator still supports it and would introduce it in a heartbeat if she thought it could pass. I'm going to be a little depressing for a second, if that's okay. People on sort of my left progressive side of the aisle in the United States are really so Republicans control both the House of Representatives and the Senate right now. There's an election next week. It looks like the House is probably going to flip to Democrat. Looks like the Senate probably won't, but we don't know. To be a little depressing, this gets worse if the Democrats take power. The Democrats are constantly being accused of being soft on crime, et cetera, and this is a nice little nugget that they can give to law enforcement to prove that they're tough on crime. So while I may be rooting for this to happen, it's going to make my professional life harder when and if it does. So this is the closest thing that I've been able to figure out about what Trump thinks about encryption. I mean, he also said that he was going to boycott Apple, and we all know how that turned out. So, I don't know. This doesn't sound friendly to me.
Doesn't mean anything.
Yeah, parse this.
I couldn't parse it.
No, neither could I. Sessions, maybe a little bit more cogent, which is a horrible thing to say, that Jeff Sessions is more cogent than anything. But he is. He looks like he's a pretty significant opponent of encryption. And I'm not even going here. So now, I'm going to get into a little bit of predict mode. What are we looking at in 2019? All of these predictions, I think, will hold true. These are predictions for all of the Five Eyes countries: UK, Canada, US, Australia, and New Zealand. Those are the Five Eyes. Back in colonialist times, we might have called them the White Dominions or something like that. I don't know. These are the countries whose intelligence agencies cooperate intimately, probably more so than any other block of countries in the world. Are we looking at a key escrow mandate in the Five Eyes? I don't think so. I think they were burned so badly by Clipper that they're not going to try it again. Burr Feinstein, are we looking at something like this to the outlawing of general purpose computing? No, even the United States Senate is not so clueless as to actually pass that, at least not in the draft form that we've seen. What about a mandate that says we don't care how, just design something where you can make clear text available to us on demand? That's the route the UK and Australia are taking. Will this actually happen in 2019? Well, the UK has already passed the law giving themselves the power to do it. Will they actually do it? I don't know. And if they do, will we know that they did? Maybe, maybe not. But even if they do, it's not going to work any better this time than it did last time. Information doesn't particularly care about national borders. These aren't centrifuges or Scud missiles that you can stop at the border. We live in a world with strong cryptography. The cat is out of the bag, if you will. And there's nothing that the US government, the Canadian government, or any of the Five Eyes can really do about that. We have things like Tor. If OTR had a logo, I would have put OTR's logo up. But it doesn't. And we have, things like Signal. We have things like iMessage and WhatsApp, which, there's probably, except Ian, who doesn't have a smartphone, there's probably some kind of strong encryption on all of our phones right now in this room. It wasn't particularly true when Gilmore said that the internet can route around interpret censorships as damage and routes around it. But that's a lot more true today. We have VPNs. We have Tor. And you can't ban every book on encryption in every library around the world. Or you could try, but it's not going to be successful. You can't shut down Wikipedia at this point. It is too big. I'm not going to talk about the House Committee. So there was some good stuff coming out of the last House, believe it or not. This is all out of Bob Goodlatte's office, and I'm not a Bob Goodlatte fan. So someone hit him with the clue stick. Anywho, this might change if the Dems take the House. What's actually likely to happen in 2019? More informal pressure. This is something that I see in my job at the Electronic Frontier Foundation semi-regularly. We have had clients who produce tools that use strong encryption who have gotten a very friendly phone call from someone at the FBI that says, can we come down to your office to talk? They come down to the office to talk and are accompanied by people from other three-letter agencies. And they're shown beheading photos or child exploitation imagery. Then they say that your service, your software, your hardware is being used to facilitate this awful thing. And if you don't give us the backdoor that we want, blood will be on your hands. Those meetings don't just happen at the small company level. They happen in Cupertino and in Mountain View as well. And we're going to continue to see this. I don't think that any mandate that goes into law in at least the Five Eyes, China, Russia, India, Turkey, Brazil may be different, but at least in the Five Eyes, nothing that we see is going to touch free and open source encryption. The freedom of expression traditions, at least in the Americas, are strong enough to prevent this. We might see, at least in the United States, a CALEA-like mandate. CALEA is the Communications Assistance for Law Enforcement Act. CALEA was passed in 1994, back when digital telephony was first starting. CALEA says you have to give us a wiretap interface to your phone system, both cellular and landline, and was later extended to voice over IP. CALEA actually has a carve-out for encryption where the provider doesn't hold the key. If the provider provides encryption but doesn't hold the key, they're exempt from CALEA. This is great. This is something that we use a lot. It also doesn't touch a service that doesn't touch the actual plain old telephone system. So if you develop a VoIP system that doesn't have interconnectivity with the telephone system, you're not subject to CALEA. So like Skype and Google Voice are subject to CALEA. FaceTime and FaceTime audio, WhatsApp audio, Signal audio are not subject to CALEA because they do not interface with the telephone system. This might work against Apple and Google and Facebook, which is the provider of WhatsApp. It's not going to touch things like Signal or side-loaded apps that you get off GitHub or whatever. So I don't think it's not the end of the world, but what it does mean is it pulls strong encryption out of the hands of the everyday user and keeps it only in our hands, not the world I want to live in. And then, of course, in 2019, we might see countries around the world do dumb things. Kazakhstan has a requirement, for instance, that everyone browsing the internet has to install their key in their trust store so they can man in the middle all of your TLS. That's fun. And continued litigation. We are bound to see this, and if that litigation happens in the US, EFF will be at the forefront of it. If it happens outside the US, we will be a supporting partner. Hopefully the litigation will be in public. The Apple versus FBI was the last big public litigation that we saw on this. I am hoping that Facebook and Apple will challenge any order that they get in the UK. I'm not particularly optimistic about Facebook. I am cautiously optimistic about Apple. Apple is big enough that they might play chicken with the UK government. If the UK government orders them to stop providing end-to-end encryption in iMessage, I have this fantasy that Tim Cook says, okay, then no iPhones for you, Brits. And then we'll see how long the government survives. I give it a couple of days. I don't think that, that Facebook is going to go that route. Why do I think that Facebook is not going to go that route? Their new head of government relations is Nick Clegg. Their policy head of everything that covers encryption is a former Scotland Yard counterterrorism person. Their head of US policy on these issues is a former child sex crimes prosecutor. So, and the founders of WhatsApp both quit in a huff over unspecified issues. So, a note of sanity, perhaps. This was the Bob Goodlatte quote that I was referring to earlier. Who knows? Maybe if the Republicans hold the House, we're safe on this? Okay, we've got 6 minutes left before this thing is over, so I'm done.
I think what was, when we see the way lawmakers say, well, okay, if you can't do this, then you can, and it's almost magic. I mean, we see it as magic. They think it's just the technology because they see, they can't distinguish between magic and technology. So they think they're saying technology when they're really saying magic, and only we can tell that. Now, I think that's coming from what I think is the AI misnamed, the misnamed AI problem. We, computer scientists, understand that what AI means is that the intelligence is artificial, that it's fake, it's not real intelligence. From the way I've heard ordinary people talk, and the analogies they use and the metaphors they use, I've come to the conclusion that when they hear artificial intelligence, they hear real intelligence on an artificial being.
Yep.
So, Alexa is an artificial being, but if it's got AI, Alexa is really intelligent. So, Alexa can make reasoning jump. Okay, so and this kind of magic thinking is permeating, mainly because the movies and TV and everything show these miracles happening where some techno geek comes in and solves the police problem by rewiring something.
Enhance.
Yeah. Okay. So you get this magic thing. And to some extent, we're responsible for that. So we need to start changing the name of AI to fake intelligence to make it very clear that it's not intelligent.
I think that's great. So the question was, isn't some of this magical thinking problem exacerbated or maybe even caused by this perception that AI is actual intelligence rather than fake intelligence? Yeah, of course it is. I mean, this has been a problem for decades, right? The United States got our draconian computer security laws, the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act, we got because Ronald Reagan watched war games and was terrified by it. And that's what led to the passage of the CFAA. This sort of conflation of, okay, my former colleague Kevin Bankston, who's now at the Open Technology Institute, just wrote a paper about how science fiction and tech policy, there's lots of crossover, and sometimes tech policy is enacted against a science fiction threat. And sometimes science fiction develops based on what they see going on in Washington or Ottawa. And there's actually an academic field of study about this question, about how fantasy influences tech policy.
Oh, okay, I'm going to have to look that up.
Yeah.
Okay, thanks.
I'm intrigued by the UK law that affects anyone, anywhere in the world. That seems to be a thing that countries like these days. And another situation where that's happening right now is Iran sanctions, where there are laws in Europe that say you can't put barriers against on anyone against commerce with Iran, and there are laws in the US that are changing that. Are there any countries that have enacted you can't do business with us, you can't do business anywhere in the world if you do put things in place of encryption? That are sort of the reverse to the UK law saying if you want to do business anywhere in the UK, anywhere, and you're anywhere in the world, you have to have this?
No. So the question is, are there any countries in the world that have enacted sort of the opposite of the Investigatory Powers Act, that you can't do business with us if you do a law enforcement backdoor? No, for two reasons. The Netherlands is the country that's come closest. The Netherlands has an explicit policy against backdoors. However, the question of what is a backdoor, like, is email a backdoor technology, right, is sort of hard. The Netherlands is close, though.
So you referenced the paper written by, like, Matt Green. Yeah. And you say that this was really great, kind of rare to actually use and, like, give to people in Washington to help them understand about why these type of policies. Yeah, that one. About, like, why these type of policies are potentially hurtful. I guess, like, what, as, like, security researchers, what can we do better to do more things like
yeah.
Is this a rarity, and, like, are there things we can do in our everyday to make this not so rare?
So the question is, as computer scientists and as computer security researchers, how can we make our work more digestible to people who are not like us? And the answer is, make people who are not like you read it before you publish it. Like, Ian, when you're on a committee, a conference committee, a program committee, I assume that's actually probably one of the things you're looking for is nope. Well, I put my foot in my mouth there. But yeah, so one of the things that I do when more than half of my writing at this point is aimed at general audience, not at non-lawyers. And when I write, I make my friends who are not lawyers, or who are lawyers but not tech lawyers, read it and make sure that what I'm writing is accessible. Because I'm so deep into this stuff that, you know, I can say key escrow and I know what that means and you all know what that means and I assume everybody knows what that means. And that's not true, right? That's not even close to true. So yeah, just make other people read your stuff, and if they don't understand it, it's not their problem, it's your problem.
There's time for a quick question. Yeah.
So one problem I faced a few years ago with the Snowden revelation was that some people do not seem to care about security. They don't care about the privacy, they think they have nothing to hide. Is that an effective way to win them over?
So the question is, what do I say about the nothing to hide argument? I have been asked this question a lot, so I have a canned soundbite answer, which I'll give you now. So the thing that I say is, I don't care about freedom of speech. I don't have anything to say. I'm uninteresting, and no one listens to me. But I benefit from other people's freedom of speech because I'm able to hear all of these diverse ideas coming at me from every direction, and that helps shape my thinking. Similarly, I don't have anything to hide. I'm a straight white dude in San Francisco. Like, what do I have to hide? I benefit from other people having privacy and security because privacy and security, privacy in particular, is a cornerstone of social change. We wouldn't have had a gay rights movement. We wouldn't have had a civil rights movement without the organizers of those movements being able to organize free of prying eyes. If I'm a gay teenager in Saudi Arabia, I sure as hell need encryption. If I'm a human rights worker in Syria, if I'm a journalist in Russia, I need encryption. And me, straight white dude in San Francisco who has nothing to hide, benefits from those people being able to hide things from their respective governments. Just as Martin Luther King being able to organize, well, forget about COINTELPRO for a second, Martin Luther King being able to organize in the United States in private was part of what made the civil rights movement work. So social change and democracy, which I think are positive things, are dependent on privacy and security of everyone, especially people with unpopular ideas. And 2018 is sort of a shitty time to say that, because the people with unpopular ideas right now are people who I really disagree with. But just as I will fight to the death for their right to say things I disagree with, I will fight for their right to do so on encrypted channels.